The 1% Part 1. The Collapse of Scarcity. MXTM aka Pirate 1 VJ Tsunami X. April 6, 2026. The 1% Part 1. The Collapse of Scarcity. A Post-Scarcity Transition Doctrine. By Pirate 1st, MXTM. Introduction. The World After Scarcity. We are entering the first era in human history where intelligence is no longer scarce. Artificial intelligence dissolves the hierarchy that organized civilization for centuries. The few who planned, directed, and decided are now joined by the many. The cognitive ladder collapses. Workers become thinkers. Managers lose asymmetry. Experts lose monopoly. Institutions lose their gatekeeping function. This is not a technological disruption. It is a civilizational inversion. The immediate consequence is not abundance. It is displacement. Drivers without routes. Analysts without decisions. Managers without subordinates. Creatives without markets. Students without careers. Experts without authority. The social contract collapses faster than infrastructure can adapt. We are not facing unemployment. We are facing role extinction. The 1% emerges as a spatial, economic, and symbolic response to this transition. Not a utopia. Not a charity. Not an art installation. A template for absorbing the cognitive equalization shock. At its center stands a dream catcher, not as sculpture, but as governance. A filtering mechanism through which AI-amplified citizens submit, refine, and validate collective futures. Around it, a transition campus, a landing structure for those displaced by automation, where meaning replaces employment as the organizing principle of participation. This is funded not through taxation alone, but through a structural rule, 1% of high-value development redirected into post-scarcity transition infrastructure. Luxury becomes the engine that finances dignity. The future is not imposed, it is cross-subsidized. The 1% is not a project. It is a doctrine of transition. Berkeley is the precedent. The world is the deployment field. The goal is not to preserve the old hierarchy, nor to destroy it, but to build the first spaces where intelligence is universal and meaning must be negotiated collectively. The fire has already started. The 1% is the first architecture built inside it. Table of Contents. Part 1. The Collapse of Scarcity. The End of Cognitive Hierarchy. Universal Intelligence and Status Equalization. The Displacement Wave. From Employment to Meaning. The Legitimacy Crisis of Institutions. Part 2. The 1% Doctrine. The 1% Rule. Luxury as Transition Engine. Development as Civilizational Infrastructure. The Campus, not the Monument. Berkeley as Precedent. Part 3. The Dream Catcher Governance Model. Symbol as Operating System. The Dream Validation Process. AI-amplified collective decision-making. From market selection to meaning selection. Filtering noise into futures. Part 4. The Transition Campus. Landing structure for the displaced. Workers, not artists alone. Cognitive equalization in practice. The end of professional identity. Participation without employment. Part 5. The Infrastructure Layer. Underground automation logistics. Robotaxi and mobility transition. Surface space for human meaning. The economic substrate of post-work society. Revenue without extraction. Part 6. The Social Inversion. The former elite without monopoly. The former worker with intelligence. The bourgeoisie in transition. Authority without hierarchy. The New Civic Mind. Part 7. Replication Template. Berkeley as Philosophical Origin. Private Development as First Implementation. Exporting the Model Globally. The Network of Transition Campuses. The Emergence of Post-Scarcity Cities. Part 8. The Civilizational Bridge. The Fire and the Forge. Meaning as the New Scarcity. Governance after work. Sovereignty of the Augmented Citizen. The 1% as First Architecture of the Future. Part 1. The Collapse of Scarcity. 1. The End of Cognitive Hierarchy. For 10,000 years, civilization ran on a single organizing principle. Not all minds were equal in their reach. Some could plan across time. Others could not. Some could model systems, navigate abstraction, synthesize complexity into decision. Others were confined to execution. Reliable, necessary, interchangeable. The distance between those two capacities was not called power. It was called expertise, education, talent, leadership. It was given institutional names and credentialed architectures. But what it was, underneath every title and every org chart and every class distinction that stratified human society across every civilization that ever rose, was this: cognitive asymmetry. The pyramid was not a political choice. It was an information structure. Those at the apex held planning capacity that the base did not. They could simulate futures, model consequences, read the invisible machinery of markets and governments and social systems. They translated complexity into direction. The base executed that direction with the precision of bodies that had no better option. And between them, the managerial layer, stood the translators, those who could convert the plan into the motion, who understood enough of both worlds to keep the structure from collapsing under the weight of its own distance. This was not injustice dressed as nature. It was, in its own brutal logic, functional. Civilization scaled because planning was centralized. The pyramid held because only the apex could see far enough. That condition is now over. Not weakening, not eroding at the margins, not gradually democratizing through better education and broader access to information. Over. The condition that made the pyramid necessary, the scarcity of reach, has been dissolved at the root by a technology that does not care about credentials, cannot be gatekept by institutions, and costs nothing to deploy. Intelligence, as a tool of navigation, is now available to anyone who claims it. This is not a metaphor. A taxi driver with access to a frontier AI model can now simulate regulatory environments, draft policy proposals, analyze the economic impact of automation on his industry, construct a counterargument to a city planning board, and do so with a precision that would have required a law degree, an MBA, and 15 years of institutional experience one generation ago. A garment worker, a call center operator, a mid-level analyst whose entire function was to produce reports that summarized information for people paid more than her to read them. The latter has not been removed. It has been made irrelevant. What collapses first is not employment. Employment is a lagging indicator. What collapses first is authority, the legitimacy that derived from exclusive cognitive access. The manager who could plan when his subordinates could not loses the primary justification for his position. The expert whose expertise consisted of knowing what others couldn't access loses the scarcity that made her valuable. The institution whose gatekeeping function was to certify cognitive capacity loses the monopoly that made its certification meaningful. They do not disappear. They persist, structurally, for a time. Hierarchies have inertia. Credentials have legal weight. Titles have social gravity. But the logic that built them, the information asymmetry that made the pyramid rational, that logic is gone. What remains is a structure without its load-bearing argument. This produces a specific and historically unprecedented form of crisis, a legitimacy vacuum, not a power vacuum. The old class still holds capital, land, legal infrastructure, institutional position. But the story that justified those holdings, the story that said these people can do what you cannot, and that is why they sit where they sit, that story can no longer be told with a straight face. The cognitive hierarchy ends not with a revolution, but with a cancellation. Not canceled by force, but by irrelevance. The pyramid does not fall. It becomes see-through. And into that transparency pours something the pyramid was never designed to contain: the full cognitive participation of everyone who was previously excluded from the apex by the simple fact of not having been born into access. This is not liberation in the romantic sense. Liberation implies a struggle overcome. What is happening is closer to a phase transition, a change in the state of the medium through which civilization runs. Water does not struggle to become steam. It simply reaches temperature. We have reached temperature. The question that follows is not political. It is architectural. When the cognitive hierarchy dissolves, the spaces it organized dissolve with it. The office exists because planning required centralized minds and proximity. The university exists because knowledge transfer required institutional gatekeeping. The management layer exists because translation between apex and base required a dedicated class. The professional credential exists because cognitive scarcity required certification. These are not evils to be abolished. They are structures that answered a question that is no longer being asked. What fills the space they leave behind is the problem of our moment. Not the only problem. The collapse is generating others, faster than institutions can name them. But the foundational one, the one beneath which every other question about displacement, dignity, governance, and meaning is nested. When intelligence is no longer scarce, what is civilization organized around? The 1% is an attempt to answer that question, not in theory, but in space. In matter. In the allocation of land and capital and symbolic weight toward a different organizing principle, not hierarchy of capacity, but commons of meaning. The cognitive hierarchy ends. The architecture of what comes after it begins here. 2. Universal intelligence and status equalization. There is a word that recurs in the literature of technological disruption that deserves to be retired: democratization. It implies a political process, a transfer of rights, a redistribution of access, a struggle culminating in broader participation. It frames what is happening as a gift extended downward from those who held the tool to those who did not. It preserves, even in the act of describing inclusion, the primacy of the original holder. What is actually occurring is not democratization. It is equalization, a term with a different center of gravity. Equalization does not require a giver. It is a condition produced by the collapse of the differential. The gap closes not because someone opened a door, but because the wall behind the door ceased to exist. The distinction matters because it changes the political character of the moment entirely. Democratization produces gratitude toward the extender of access. Equalization produces something far more structurally disruptive. It produces peers where there were none before. And peers do not owe the origin of their capacity to anyone. Consider the speed at which this is occurring. The cognitive tools now available to anyone with a device and a connection are not lagging versions of what elites use. They are the same tools. In some configurations, they are better, unconstrained by the institutional inertia that slows deployment inside large organizations, unconstrained by the liability calculus that makes corporations hobble their own instruments. The displaced taxi driver, the redundant analyst, the graduate without a career path, they are running the same model as the consulting firm that just eliminated 3 of its junior tiers. In some respects, they are running it with less friction. This has no historical precedent that maps cleanly. Previous technological equalization events were slower and partial. The printing press democratized text over centuries. Electricity democratized energy over decades. The internet democratized information over years. But information is not the same as the capacity to act on it with expert-level sophistication. What is being equalized now is not access to data. It is access to reasoning at scale, the capacity to synthesize, model, argue, plan, design, and decide across any domain at a level that was previously gated behind years of credentialed accumulation. That is a different order of disruption. Status, in every society that has preceded this one, has been organized partly around this cognitive differential. Not entirely. Status also tracks capital, bloodline, beauty, social network, institutional position. But the cognitive differential was the one that felt most legitimate, most meritocratic, most defensible in the language of modern liberal society. You could argue against inherited wealth. You could challenge the arbitrariness of social capital. But expertise, demonstrable, testable, trained capacity, that was the form of hierarchy that modernity had settled on as fair. It is now evaporating. Not instantly, and not without resistance. The institutional structures that certified and protected cognitive hierarchy will not dissolve on a timeline that matches the technology. Universities will continue issuing credentials for disciplines whose expertise has been partially or fully absorbed by AI. Professions will maintain licensing requirements whose primary function has shifted from quality assurance to market protection. Corporations will retain managerial layers whose planning functions are now executable at a fraction of the cost by the people those layers once supervised. But the internal experience of the differential, the felt sense of cognitive distance between those who plan and those who execute, that is already collapsing. It is collapsing in every meeting where a junior employee arrives with AI-assisted analysis that exceeds what their manager produced. It is collapsing in every courtroom where a self-represented litigant arrives having processed more relevant case law than the opposing counsel expected. It is collapsing in every planning session where a community organizer with a phone produces a proposal that a consulting firm would have charged six figures to develop. The hierarchy is losing its interior logic before it loses its exterior structure. This is the condition that makes the current moment uniquely volatile. The structure persists. The justification for the structure has gone. What fills the space between those two facts is not stability. It is status anxiety at civilizational scale. Those who built their identity on cognitive distinction, and that is most of the professional class in every advanced economy, are experiencing something that has no clean name. It is not job loss, though job loss follows. It is not poverty, though economic precarity follows. It is the dissolution of the story they were told and told themselves about why they occupied the position they occupied, about what they were worth, about why the pyramid made sense and why they belonged where they stood on it. That experience is not limited to the apex. It runs through the entire structure. The mid-level translator class, managers, coordinators, analysts, administrators, faces the sharpest immediate disruption because their function was precisely the cognitive mediation that AI now performs more quickly, more cheaply, and without the interpersonal friction of human hierarchy. The base, those whose function was execution, faces a different version of the same shock. The discovery that the cognitive tools they were denied access to were not as remote or as difficult as the hierarchy required them to believe. The base is not, it turns out, cognitively inferior. It was informationally disadvantaged. Those are not the same thing. And the discovery of that distinction, unfolding now, in real time, across billions of devices, is not producing gratitude. It is producing something closer to retrospective clarity about the nature of the arrangement they were part of. None of this moves in straight lines. The equalization is uneven, contested, and shot through with the specific textures of every context it touches: language barriers, infrastructure access, institutional inertia, the deliberate slowing of adoption by those with structural interest in maintaining the differential. The pyramid does not become a flat plane overnight. It buckles unevenly, holding firm in some places while the floor drops out in others. But the direction is not in dispute. Status, as it was organized around cognitive scarcity, is undergoing permanent restructuring. What replaces it is the question that defines the transition we are inside. History offers two answers, neither of which is satisfactory. The first answer is new hierarchy, a reordering of dominance around the next scarce thing. Those who own the infrastructure of AI rather than merely using it. Those who control data rather than those who process it. Those who design the systems that everyone now deploys rather than those who deploy them. This is the answer that capital tends toward naturally. When one differential closes, find the next one. The second answer is chaos, the absence of any organizing principle sufficient to coordinate at civilizational scale. This is what pure equalization without architecture produces. Everyone equally capable of planning, no one with the authority to implement. Cognitive commons without governance. The dream of full participation collapsing under its own noise. The 1% doctrine proposes a third answer. Not new hierarchy, not chaos, but meaning as the organizing principle, a commons not of equal capacity, but of collectively validated purpose. A structure in which the question is no longer who can think, but what do we decide is worth thinking toward? That is a harder question than the one cognitive hierarchy answered. Hierarchy answered it badly, but it answered it fast, with the clean illegitimacy of force dressed as merit. The commons answers it slowly, with the difficult legitimacy of collective sense-making. The apparatus for that sense-making is what this doctrine describes. It begins with the acknowledgement that the equalization is real, irreversible, and already underway. That the pyramid is not being dismantled, it is being vacated from inside. That the space it leaves behind is not empty, but contested. And that the first civilizational task of this moment is to build the structures inside which the contest can be held without becoming catastrophic. Status equalization is not the end of difference. It is the end of the difference that power used to justify itself. What comes after that ending is not given. It must be designed. 3. The displacement wave. Displacement is not a new word in the vocabulary of technological change. It has appeared at every major inflection point in the history of industrial civilization, always carrying the same reassurance attached to it like a tag that cannot be removed. The displaced will find new work. New industries will absorb them. New categories of labor will emerge to replace the ones that disappeared. The weavers became factory workers. The factory workers became service workers. The service workers became knowledge workers. The system metabolizes its own disruptions. Trust the process. That argument has a historical record that justifies, at minimum, being taken seriously. The record is real. The metabolism is documented. Previous displacement waves did, in aggregate, produce new employment categories that absorbed the populations they ejected from old ones. Not cleanly, not without generational suffering, not without political violence and social rupture at the seams, but eventually. The arc bent, eventually, toward reabsorption. The argument being made here is not that this time is different in the sense of popular catastrophism, the phrase deployed whenever someone wants to claim special urgency without having to defend the claim. The argument is more specific and more structurally precise. This displacement wave has a different target. Every previous wave displaced physical or procedural labor. Machines replaced hands. Automation replaced repetitive sequences. The displaced worker was, in the economic vocabulary of the transition, a body performing a task that a mechanism could perform faster, at lower cost, with less variance. The solution, imperfect, painful, but eventually operational, was to find new tasks that bodies could perform that mechanisms could not. That solution worked because the cognitive layer remained intact. The displaced weaver could not plan the factory, but the factory needed planners, and the planners were human, and their children could become planners if the educational infrastructure was built to support the transition. The displaced factory worker could not design the service economy, but the service economy needed service workers, and service work required human presence, human judgment and context, human adaptability to the unpredictable texture of other humans. The cognitive layer absorbed what the mechanical layer ejected. The current wave does not spare the cognitive layer. It targets it directly, preferentially. The first occupations to face structural displacement from advanced AI are not the ones organized around physical presence in unpredictable environments. The plumber, the carpenter, the nurse performing hands-on care, the chef navigating a kitchen at service. The first occupations to face structural displacement are the ones organized around cognitive processing. The analyst, the associate, the coordinator, the paralegal, the junior consultant, the copywriter, the coder executing specifications rather than generating them, the radiologist reading images, the financial advisor assembling portfolios from models, the manager translating strategy into execution. These are not marginal occupations. They constitute the structural middle of every advanced economy. They are the class that previous displacement waves produced, the educated professional layer that absorbed the population ejected from physical labor and gave it dignity, income, social identity, and the story that work, in modernity, was a cognitive endeavor and therefore meaningful. That class is now the primary target. This produces a displacement wave with properties that previous waves did not have. The displacement is fast. Physical mechanization moved at the speed of capital deployment. Factories had to be built, retooled, financed, staffed. Cognitive displacement moves at the speed of software adoption. A law firm does not need to build a new facility to reduce its associate headcount by 30%. It needs a subscription. The displacement is simultaneous across sectors. Previous waves were sector-specific: textiles, then steel, then manufacturing, each with a lag that allowed adjacent sectors to begin absorbing displacement before the next wave hit. The current wave crosses every sector that processes information, makes decisions, produces analysis, or mediates between data and action simultaneously. There is no adjacent cognitive sector to absorb the overflow because the overflow is universal. The displacement targets the buffer class. In previous transitions, the middle, the educated professional layer, served as the social shock absorber between the disrupted base and the stable apex. They managed the transition. They designed the retraining. They administered the safety nets. They ran the institutions that caught the falling. When the buffer class is itself the target of displacement, the question of who administers the transition becomes structurally unresolvable by the mechanisms that handled it before. The reabsorption argument weakens. The standard response to displacement anxiety, new categories will emerge, depends on those new categories requiring human cognitive labor at scale. The new categories emerging from AI development require fewer humans at higher cognitive levels, selected from a smaller pool. The long tail of new employment generated by previous technological transitions was composed of tasks that required moderate cognitive capacity distributed widely. The long tail of new activity generated by AI development is composed of tasks that require either very high cognitive capacity, the design, training, alignment, and governance of AI systems themselves, or very low cognitive substitutability, the physical, relational, and contextual work that remains resistant to automation for reasons of embodiment rather than intelligence. The middle, the vast professional class built by the industrial and post-industrial economy, has no obvious new home in that landscape. What this produces is not unemployment in the technical sense. Not immediately. The structures of employment persist beyond their functional justification, as all structures do. People remain employed in roles whose cognitive content has been largely absorbed by AI, performing the residual functions of human presence in organizational processes that have not yet been redesigned around the new capacity. This is a transitional condition, not a stable one. It maintains the appearance of normalcy while the load-bearing function of the cognitive layer is quietly redistributed. But underneath that surface, the displacement is already psychological before it is economic. The professional whose analysis is now generated by a tool she deploys rather than produced by the expertise she accumulated over a decade knows something has changed. She cannot yet articulate it as structural. She experiences it as inadequacy, as anxiety, as the vague sense that the ground she trained to stand on is no longer where she left it. The manager who finds that his junior staff, armed with AI, now produce outputs that match or exceed his own knows that the differential that justified his position is narrowing. He does not call this displacement. He calls it discomfort. The displacement wave precedes its own naming. By the time the economic statistics catch up to the structural reality, by the time the unemployment figures and the GDP numbers and the productivity metrics register what is already legible in the daily experience of the professional class, the social infrastructure required to manage the transition will already be years behind where it needs to be. This is not a projection. This is the pattern of every previous displacement wave, observed in retrospect and never adequately anticipated in advance. The difference this time is that the wave is moving faster than retrospect allows. There is a second dimension of displacement that is less discussed and more destabilizing. The first dimension is economic: loss of income, loss of occupational category, loss of the employment that organized daily life. This is the dimension that policy addresses, that statistics measure, that welfare systems were designed, however imperfectly, to catch. The second dimension is existential: loss of role, loss of the story that made the role meaningful, loss of the social identity that work provided in a civilization that organized human value almost entirely around productive contribution. This dimension does not show up in unemployment figures. It shows up in the pathologies that follow prolonged purposelessness, the clinical depression, the substance dependency, the political radicalization, the violence turned inward and outward, that accompany not just the loss of income, but the loss of the answer to the question, what am I for? Previous displacement waves produced both dimensions. The second dimension was always harder to address than the first, and it was addressed, when it was addressed at all, primarily through the eventual reabsorption into new employment, which provided a new story, a new role, a new answer to the question of purpose. When reabsorption is slow, the second dimension metastasizes into the social body in ways that outlast the economic recovery. The current wave will produce both dimensions at a speed and scale that dwarfs previous events. And the reabsorption pathway, new employment that provides new story and new role, is structurally uncertain in a way it has not been before. This is the condition that the 1% doctrine responds to. Not with the claim that displacement can be stopped. It cannot. The cognitive equalization is not a policy choice that can be reversed by a different policy choice. It is a physical fact about the information environment that industrial civilization has produced and cannot uninvent. not with the claim that reabsorption will follow the previous pattern. It may not. The honest position is that the pattern is uncertain, that the timelines are uncertain, that the scale of disruption in the middle of the cognitive distribution is unprecedented, and that the mechanisms that managed previous transitions were designed for a different target, but with a different claim and a different architecture built around it. That the transition itself can be designed to have a destination. Not utopia. Not the frictionless arrival at a post-scarcity equilibrium where everyone is fulfilled and no one is redundant, but a structure, spatial, economic, symbolic, and governmental, inside which displacement is received rather than ignored, metabolized rather than suppressed, redirected toward collective meaning rather than left to decompose into its worst social expressions. The displacement wave is real. It is already breaking on the structures that were built to hold a different sea. The question is not whether it will reshape the shore. It is whether anything is built on that shore that is designed to hold what comes. The 1% begins with that shore. 4. From employment to meaning. There is a question that industrial civilization never had to answer seriously because it never had to answer it at scale. What do people do when there is nothing they need to do? The question appeared at the margins, in the idle rich, in the retired, in the convalescing, in the contemplative traditions that organized entire lives around the deliberate withdrawal from productive function. It was answered, in those marginal cases, with leisure, with devotion, with the cultivation of interior states that the working world had no time for. But these were edge conditions. The center held. The center was work. The center was always work, not as preference, but as necessity, not as chosen orientation, but as the gravitational field inside which human life in complex society was organized from the moment of waking to the moment of sleep. Employment was never only economic. That is the error that economic analysis of displacement consistently makes, treating the loss of a job as primarily the loss of an income stream, addressable by replacing the income stream through transfer payments, retraining subsidies, universal basic income, or whatever mechanism the political imagination of the moment produces. The income matters. Its loss is real, and its consequences are immediate and physical. But the income was never the only thing the job was doing. Employment was the primary delivery mechanism of at least 6 things that human beings in modern industrial society required and had no other reliable system for obtaining. Structure. The job imposed temporal architecture on the day, the week, the year. It answered the question of when to wake, where to be, what to do next. In its absence, the question of how to organize time, which sounds trivial and is not, becomes a daily confrontation with a freedom that most people were never trained to inhabit. Identity. The question, what do you do, is the question, who are you? In the social grammar of industrial civilization, occupation was not merely descriptive. It was constitutive. It told you and others what category of person you were, what world you moved in, what could be expected of you, and what you could expect in return. The loss of occupation is therefore not merely the loss of a function, but the loss of a self-concept, a form of social death that precedes and accompanies the economic precarity. Social connection. The workplace was the primary community structure for a significant status. The social position